I'm plugged in. Yeah.
Will it blend? Oh, it totally blends.
It blends.
All right. Welcome, everyone, to Denver Modern Web number 15. Yeah! Did it. I can't believe we're here for a 15th time. Thank you so much for coming and supporting us here. Again, this is our 15th meetup, and we've really grown a lot in the last year, and there's a ton of new faces. So just some quick ground rules. Terry is going to be our awesome presenter today. We're going to be talking about Flask and Python and API building. If you have questions throughout, feel free to just kind of raise your hand and just ask a question or just kind of shout at him. He'll survive. We also will do kind of a QA session at the end. Real quick, just a shout out to Psalm. That's where both Terry and I work in this building here. If you have any questions about what we do here at Psalm or want to know anything more about Python, you can always ask Terry or myself afterwards. Next time on Denver Modern Web, we are going to be doing a scripting attack walks into a web application, which is essentially a talk on protecting your site from malicious scripting attacks. And that's going to be on Wednesday, June 5th. Again, we are the first Wednesday of every month, outside of July because that's like the 4th of July, so we'll go out a week. But again, thank you all for coming. Normally afterwards, we just kind of hang out for a little bit, so feel free to hang out and chat with us. So thank you all for coming, and without further ado, Terry, take it away.
Cool. Thanks, Adam. So as Adam said, I'm Terry. I'm a consultant with Slalom. My previous project I was on, I was working with Flask and Python, and I just found it really nice, easy, quick, simple to build applications and interfaces to all the awesome Python libraries that are out there. There's a lot of potential for it. So I wanted to give a little talk on it, and yeah, no further ado, I'll jump into it. So to give you a quick overview of the talk, I'm going to talk through the history and philosophy of Python and Flask, and then do a quick setup of how you set up your environment, install the right versions of Python, and all that stuff, and then talk about why Flask, why Python, and then do a quick dive into the Python Flask syntax, and then build a quick API, and run through a couple upgrades or potential improvements you could do based on that base API, and then a quick Q&A session. As Adam said also, anytime you guys have questions, feel free to jump in, raise your hand, or just shout out. Like to keep it engaged and back and forth conversation. Feel free to jump in.
That's an awesome profile pic. That's like so intense.
I figured I had to.
It's like you stare into my soul.
Let's get on with it. So Flask was created originally as an April Fool's Day joke by Armin Runacher, and it's based on Jinja and Worksug. I'm probably pronouncing those all wrong, but it's basically a lightweight WSGI framework, and they tried to purposely keep it really lightweight, really simple, and any extensions. There's tons of libraries extensions out there available to be able to add on whatever features you want. It's used by Netflix, Reddit, Lyft, Pinterest, LinkedIn, and there's 600 other companies that are using it and advertise that they're using it. Python was first released in 1991 by Guido van Rossum. It's an interpreted high-level multi-paradigm language. So it basically means there's basically 4 paradigms that it can use, like object-oriented, functional, drawing a blank on the other 2. So it's great. It's a flexible, simple language. The name comes from Monty Python, not necessarily the snake, but from the British comedians there. So I figured I'd theme the slideshow with a bunch of Monty Python GIFs. And they're also really low quality, so you got to enjoy that aspect of it as well. So I guess I'll show you a quick demo of just kind of how quick and easy Python is. So if we jump into the shell here, and let's see. Good question. Is that a little better? Cool. So there's a couple different versions of Python. I'm going to use Python 3. It's a little easier. One of the Easter eggs in there is when you're importing there are the import this, and it gives you the Zen of Python. So these are the 19 principles of Python. Yeah, I'm just realizing I skipped a step. So I'll exit back out of there. And get my virtual environment set up so I'm using the right, all the imports are set in that.
What does that do?
So I can jump into that a little bit here. So Mac ships with Python 2. Python 3 is more universally used, and Python 2 they're working to deprecate. I think 2020 is what they're flagged for. And the virtual environment basically allows you to have a separate set of environments that you're working in. So like Node, you have your Node package manager that can download the dependencies you want. You can actually control your virtual environment per folder that you're working in. And so I've set up this virtual environment using virtualenv, and that allows me to import a bunch of dependencies and libraries. Yeah, so in this virtual environment, I've already imported some requirements here. If I do pip freeze, it gives you kind of your dependency list of all the dependencies that are already installed there. Thinking about it. So a lot of these are dependency of dependencies, but you can see that list there. If I jump into Python here, because I'm in my virtual environment, it should use Python 3. Oh. Try that again. Cool. So now I can import requests. No module name request. Cool. So pip install requests. Yeah, it seems like it does really want to use 2. So go back into Python. So now we can do import requirements. No, not requirements. That's why. Import requests. Cool. And then I'll just steal my code from over here to show you just making a get call against this endpoint. It'll give me the quote of the day as a response object. So I get response. I can get the JSON from that, and it gives me the quote within that JSON. And this one looks like doesn't have an author on it, but yeah.
Any chance you could move the window up a little bit because it's too low?
Sure. Go like that way. Cool. Oh, there we go. The Rodney Dangerfield quote. And so then we can also kind of dive into that request object and get the author or get just the quote out of it. Yeah, so it's a quick intro to how simple it is to get Python going once you figure out which Python version you're using and get your imports working right, of course. Then you can exit the shell. The great thing with the shell is you can test out your commands. You can build up basically a whole file just by running it all on the shell script and seeing what's coming back and debug your way through. Yeah, so that's the quick Python shell demo. Any questions there? Pretty quick and easy. So we've got Zen of Python there. And there's 19 of them, and the 20th one was left open by Tim Peters for Guido to insert his own philosophy point there, and it's intentionally left blank. But yeah, so trying to stick to simple, beautiful code and readable. Yeah, I encourage you to import this and read through those philosophy. So keep getting on with it. So I talked a little bit about Python 2 versus Python 3, but basically Mac, a lot of the OS system runs on Python 2. So in order to use Python 3, the recommended way of doing it is using Homebrew or a package installer and doing brew install Python. And then you'll be able to run using Python 3 instead. You'll just have to specify it at the command line that you're running Python 3, unless you're using the virtual environment that I touched on before. So pip is the package installer for Python. It comes with, if you do brew install Python, it comes with pip. So then you can do pip install whatever package name you want. Virtual environment I touched on already. And another way of installing your requirements is using a requirements.txt file. And so you can put your requirements in there and lock in the versions. I think I've got one in here already. Let's just see, yeah. So we can look in our requirements, and I've got Flask, Flask Coors, Flask Swagger UI, Unicorn, and Mongo Engine, what I've put in there so far. And we'll be using all those shortly. Yeah, I think that's it for that. We'll keep moving forward. So why Flask and why Python? Flask is Python-based, simple, lightweight, well-maintained. There's tons of extensions available for it. There's actually GitHub repo that has links to all the a bunch of the favorite plugins for it. So there's framework, analytics, authorization, database, all these different plugins that you can use. Within those, there's Flask, Mongo, REST, tons of framework. There's just, you can keep going forever. And these are just ones that are selected by this person as being awesome resources. Yeah. But like I said, the main reason for Flask is, or the primary reason there is that it's Python-based, which allows you to add API endpoints to all the awesome Python libraries that are out there. So Python has awesome performance, readability, lots of libraries out there. My first introduction to Python was through academic usage. I had to do a combustion simulation of a flame front using Python. And at the time, I really didn't like it. But then now, since it's kind of come up from academics, there's a lot of great data science and machine learning libraries out there. And by using Flask, you can hook into those and have kind of accessible API endpoints. Also, another reason I really like Python is the scripting is easy. There's a lot of scripting languages out there, but if you're using Python with Flask and with your libraries, and you can use it for your DevOps tools, write your Lambdas in it, you can script everything in it, and it's nice just having one language across the whole stack. Kind of like how JavaScript has now kind of worked its way back into the back end. Python is kind of working its way up to the front end. And then looking forward, language popularity. Python has, I don't know what happened here. In the past couple of years, Python's been climbing like crazy and surpassed a lot of the other main software development languages out there as far as popularity with developers. And you can see that in the chart on the right. So hopefully it just kind of keeps going up. Although a lot of times it gets to the top there and drops down, but we'll see. So we'll keep going. So Python, there's a couple of gotchas there if you're coming from other languages. Indentation matters, so you need to make sure you have your files indented correctly. It's kind of nice because it makes everything a lot cleaner and easier to read because it enforces that. You don't end up with one person using tabs and one person using spaces or any of those. Also, no semicolons at the end of the line, which threw me off at first, coming from JavaScript background. And then there's kind of some standard objects which are really nice in Python. The dictionary objects map really nicely to JSON objects, and so it's really easy to serialize things back and forth that way. And then there's some dynamic arguments you can pass in. So your methods can dynamically take multiple arguments. You're not stuck with just having a set list of arguments there. Yeah, and then Flask uses some call decorators. So app route to set the the route that you're going to be calling, the endpoint. There are some kind of tricks there with going from a dictionary object to a JSON and back and forth and stringifying it. Yeah. Other than that, environment variables are really easy to use for Flask configuration. You can call the environment variables directly, or you can set them up in a config.py file and have it be determined by your environment setting if you want to use prod settings versus dev settings and what the server names are and everything. And then finally, the extensions. So Unicorn is a WSGI framework that allows you to basically productionize the Flask. So Flask comes with just kind of a dev server, and it works pretty well. So a lot of people run that straight into production, but you run into performance issues once you're actually out in production. So it's recommended that you use a tool like Unicorn that allows for kind of multi-threading of the requests. Mongo Engine is an ORM, so that's doing the translation to connect to MongoDB. That's basically an ORM wrapper on PyMongo, which is the Python Mongo interface. And then Marshmallow is a great tool that you can use for serialization. It eases serialization, payload validation, all that stuff. And then there's extra tools you can lay on top of Marshmallow that just like supercharge the performance of the serialization. It actually does some, if you use toasted Marshmallow, then you can cache the serializing models, and so it actually makes it go about 10 times faster. Yeah, so any questions on any of those? Yeah.
What does WSGI stand for?
Web Server Gateway Interface. It's basically it's a Python spec for basically REST interactions. I think it might work for others outside of REST, but it applies to REST as well. But it's basically a standard spec that if you're implementing a tool that uses that, then it'll play nicely with everything else. Cool. Anything else? Cool. Yeah. So we'll jump in and build out the application. So basically, I'm going to jump in, create the virtual environment, and then build out a simple Flask endpoint. It basically takes just about the code here to build that out. Build a health endpoint, and then I'm going to connect into the Mongo database and be able to create some posts and get methods there. All right. So I'm going to get out of that virtual environment, and I'm going to make a new Python Flask Awesomeness. And then in here, I'm going to create my virtual environment. So the tool is virtualenv, and I'm creating this folder called venv. Just kind of the standard name for it. You could name the folder whatever you want, but it basically creates that folder. So now if I look in this directory, there's the virtual environment folder, and I can source venv, activate virtual environment. So now I'm in my virtual environment, and I can just verify that I'm using the right version. Great. And then I will go ahead and create my application. All right. So we'll start with a couple imports. So from before I jump all the way into that, we're going to go ahead and put some requirements together. So I'm going to add Flask to the requirements, txt, and what else do we need? Cores to Did I miss a? Yep. Thank you guys. Cool. So QU helps if you use consistent spelling also. Python's kind of picky about that. Maybe we'll get some more machine learning in there and then it'll just correct itself, but so far that's how it is. Let's see what else will we need. We'll need Mongo engine. There we go. Autocomplete helps. Go date time. Oh wait, that's default library. Swagger? Skip Swagger for now. Yeah, I think that should do it. So now we can pip install requirements. So this is the second way of doing it. Instead of installing each one independently, you can have this requirements file and let that run. Now while that's going, what's that? Oh, zoom in. Yeah, thanks.
Can you just show us what the requirements.txt file looks like after you did that?
Sure. Oops.
It doesn't hide on you.
Cool.
Yeah, so it just has those, and then,
Just putting the words into shape.
yep. Yeah, so it's really straightforward. And then you can do pip. Usually kind of the next step I'll do is pip freeze and just double check on what the versions are. And so you can lock in that Flask you want to use that specific version. And where's Mongo engine? So you can lock those in so that you're not getting updated if you don't want to. Yeah. Get my cheat sheet back out over here. Yeah, so I'm going to go ahead and just copy paste this part so you guys don't have to watch me flail through that. Yeah. Just ignore that for now. Yeah, so create the Flask application context. And I have to remind myself not to hit semicolons at the end of the line. And then we'll go ahead and before we connect into Mongo, we'll just go ahead and create the application, the Flask route. For the base route. And then we just start the application. And this basically, what's wrong there?
You're missing an equals.
This basically is just checking if you're starting from this file context. So if you importing this from and the application is running from somewhere else, it won't trigger this application. But if we run it from this context, then it'll start up the application. So for the example of the WSGI server I was talking about, it wouldn't enter this part because it's going to trigger its own application start method. And I think that might be all we need. So we'll go ahead and run it and see what happens. Always like to verify my version is good there. And then we just run this one. Python Flask Awesomeness. Did not like, got some extra junk in there that we might add later. Should be fine. Cool, so that's up and running. So if we go to our server here, open a new Chrome tab. Somewhere. There we go. So now we can go to localhost 5000 and we get spam. So that's as easy as it is to get the get an API up and running. Then from there, it's just kind of building out other routes and adding other logic in there. Yeah, any questions so far? Yeah.
So in VS Code, can you set breakpoints there and run it through the debugger?
Yeah, you can. There's a plugin. I haven't used it recently. It's too big. Yeah, so you can set by default kicked off something running there. But this VS Code has this launch.json, and you can modify this Flask running. And so instead of app, I want to be running Flask, Python Flask Awesomeness. And so then I can go to Python Flask and go ahead and throw a breakpoint in here.
So I'm assuming that's the same spot you do build flavors kind of as well, right? Prod, dev, staging, this initialization.
No, it's a slightly different one for that, but it is similar. It's another JSON file, or actually that's a Python file that I'll usually use for that configuration. Yeah, so we got our breakpoint, and it's already running, so got to kill that process, of course. Oh, because it's running in the other console. So now we're running in the debugger, run that, and we hit that breakpoint. Yeah, any other questions?
How do you organize your code? Is it just a single file or?
Sure, yeah, I can, I was thinking of building it out, but I'll probably just jump to one that works already, and I can show you a quick walkthrough of that. Let's just open a new window. So this was a basic one I was building out, just setting up for this demo. And so I'll have a models directory and an API directory. And so you can have a couple different application entry points. A lot of times people just start with app.py, and that's kind of the default for a lot of the plugins and tools that work with it. Like in the debugger, I had to change the name of that Python file. And so then in here, you can do things. So at the default route, I've got a redirect that sends you over to health check, which is underneath API health. And it'll go to this endpoint, the health check, which returns the version and the health and the reason. So it'll try to connect to MongoDB and say whether it can connect or not. Make sure this one's stopped, and I can go ahead and fire up this other one. I might just do it command line. And one thing when you're using virtual environment is you got to kind of keep track of which folder you're activated from, because it'll keep using those dependencies from over there. And if you install new dependencies,
If you switch to a different project, it'll still use the one from the other project.
yeah, so I navigated up and went over to this other directory, but it was still in that virtual environment. So it was still using the VM folder that was in Python Flask Awesomeness. So a lot of times when I was starting out, I'd get tripped up by that and be like, code was working just a minute ago and now it's not working. So then we just have to do source VM activate in that directory, and Python version, and that one has the wrong version. So let me just get this cleaned up here. There we go. So then source VM activate. Okay, now we're on the right version. Just make sure our requirements are up to date. Cool, so we got our server up and running. So yeah, so I can show you if we go to that base route, localhost 5000 now. I think it's trying to reach this health endpoint. Let's just take a look at the console here. Yeah, so it's received the GET. This health endpoint actually makes a call to Mongo database to see if it's alive, which has about a 30-second timeout on the default connection. And so, yeah, we've got, it's dead. Failed to connect to the database. So then we can go back and start up Mongo. So that's all running now. We can run this again, and it's not dead yet. I'm getting better. Yeah, but back to your question about kind of structuring it. You can kind of structure the code around however you like. There is a trick with Python that you can't import up and over to other packages. And so you need to create these init.py files within these other directories to then allow API to be imported. So a simpler one to look at is this models. So within the models, I have a quote object, which uses this Mongo engine document, inherits from that. And then these are basically the fields on the quote there. And then in the API, it's importing from models quote to then use that for the serialization and deserialization of the requests. And I can show this one is a little bit easier to show. Because I've added authentication on it, we get an unauthorized 401, I believe, network. Yeah, so we get a 401 back, and that's because, yeah, so I'm kind of starting to get into the next slide, which is more about kind of optimizations. But yeah, so before I go down that route too far, are there any other questions on, or did that answer your question about the structure? How I structure the code? Oh, that's your question, sorry. Yeah. But yeah, so you can kind of break it up, and then these init.py allow it to be kind of a module that you're importing into your base class.
Do you have an example of getting data out of the database here?
Yeah.
Or is that part of the next section?
Yeah, I can go ahead and show that. Yeah, so here's an example of, so this one I'm calling API v1 quote, and it's returning quote object from MongoDB. I can also, yeah. So that is entering, so this one enters, comes in, hits this app before request. So this I use for kind of pre-authentication checks. And so then I'm checking, I've got a static list of unprotected routes. These typically would be more in an environment variable. And say, okay, if it's not in these unprotected routes, then get the authorization token from the header. And if it's not there, I'm returning unauthorized 401. If it is there, then I return, if it is there, but it doesn't match valid token, which is just default string, then I'm returning 403. Really, this would be, you could use the JWT token and do the coding of that and validate the token there. This is just kind of a simple example. So, yeah, so all the requests will then go through that before they're allowed to be passed forward. So it hits that before request and then goes into API get quotes. Then in here, it's using, I've added a search parameter so you can look at the request arguments. So the request arguments is part of Flask. So you can pull those out of the request. So in this case, those are query parameters. Let me see if yeah, which I don't have that there. Oh, that's create quote, get quotes. So that was actually, I was showing you guys the post to create the quotes, and so I created it twice. But yeah, so we've got 2 total quotes, and this is an example of the formatting not working ideally when you JSONify JSON within JSON. And so these kind of are a bit of a headache sometimes to get that parsed out right. But you can see it's escaping each of the quotes inside there. But yeah, so I'm doing a search within there. So the query parameter is pulling the search value there. Request args gets the search. That comes back as a search string. And then if the search string isn't null, then I'm doing a case insensitive if the quote field contains the search string. So then this is using the Mongo engine quote, or Mongo engine document, which quote is inheriting from, to use the objects to call to Mongo engine. And then I also have some pagination in there, which I'm not using on the front end yet. Yeah?
I have a couple of questions. Can you define before request for specific routes? Like the login route doesn't necessarily need to be authorized.
Yeah, I haven't done it that way of specifying the route there. More just kind of as the first check, I'll say, is it in this list of unauthorized routes? And I found that's kind of better than saying authorized routes, because if you specify the authorized routes, then somebody's going to forget to put one in there. It's better to be explicit about which ones. I think it.
Give us an example of I forget the name, but it's like a route parameter. So
Oh yeah. Yeah, so you pass that in, that comes in as the argument here, so we could say, quotes, ID, and you can give it a default value there, and so it'll take that ID and pass it into the argument, and then you can say, I don't know where the best place would be, but if we do if ID is not none, then yeah, so you can use it kind of like that. And so if that ID is not present, then it wouldn't filter on that. Yeah.
What other databases Flask integrates with?
The main one I see a lot of tutorials about is using SQL Alchemy to integrate with various MySQL or other like relational-based databases. The nice thing is it plays really well with like document store databases. So MongoDB, and then we actually wired it over to connect to DocumentDB in AWS instead, and that was pretty much a straight swap out there. You just changed.
What about graph databases like Neo4j?
I'm not sure on graph databases. Let me see if. Oh. Flask. Yeah, so it looks like basically SQL and Mongo. But yeah, it's a good question. Python does have some pretty amazing like data like reducing capabilities. And so I would almost imagine that you'd replace some of that graph database functionality with some of the built-in functionality in Python. You can do map reduce and all those kind of things within Python itself, as opposed to depending on the graph database. But there's, for every case, there's probably 10 different ways to do it. Cool. Yeah, if there's no other questions, we'll keep plowing along, and I think we're almost done here. And then talking about some improvements to make. So adding authentication, I touched on that a little bit. One other thing I'll probably show you is just how you use the WSGI server and implement Unicorn if you want to actually productionize it. Environment variables, API caching, containerization is really easy to spin up a Docker instance with the Python version you want to use. You just write the Docker file and spin that up. Serialization, we touched on Marshmallow and Toasted Marshmallow for serialization optimizing. And then Swagger is nice to have. You just like with all the other languages that integrate with Swagger, you can both generate server and client code, or you can generate Swagger documentation based on your code. Personally, I don't like having all this Swagger overhead in the code, but I like having it available for sharing with other teams that are integrating with my systems. So I'll usually try to maintain a Swagger YAML file that documents what the endpoints are, and you can test them out and everything. But yeah, so real quick, I'll show you the WSGI setup. So WSGI, so I'm using Unicorn. There are a couple other ones out there, but Unicorn is the easiest one that I've found. And basically, you have a shell script that is your entry point to your application. In there, you set up your port and you can set your log level and all that stuff. And this then calls into this WSGI Python script. And this one is pointing at this other Python here, so we changed that to, it was a more basic one I was using. And it'll start up the application that way. And so this is entering the name equals main application context this way. So it wouldn't be using the one within at the bottom of pfa.py. Yeah, so just the name variable is coming from Python itself. It's kind of like a reserved keyword.
Can we mean Java almost for this, or like?
Is what's that?
Kind of like Java in a way, where things like remain and all that, like.
Yeah, like public static void main or whatever. Like that's like the entry point.
My brain instantly something like that.
Yeah. So anytime you see like double underscores in front of either variable or a file name or a method name, those are, so Python, one thing it doesn't have for object-oriented is doesn't have encapsulation. So there's no concept of private versus public. So if you add the init.py, then anything can use that file externally. And so a lot of times you'll just indicate that this is a private variable and you shouldn't update it by putting double underscore in front of it.
But it doesn't actually prevent you from doing it.
Right. It just kind of puts the bumpers on, but you can still drive right through it. Yeah. Cool. So I'll go ahead and kill that service. And if we launch it with the entry point script, then because I'm doing it on 0.0.0.0, it gives me this warning if I'm going to allow outside connections to come in. You don't need to allow them in to use it, but that was a configuration we had to do for Docker, because if you're running a Docker container, you need to allow external connections to connect to it. That tripped me up for a little bit when I first figured that out. But we can see here that we've got, it starts up 2 unicorn workers there with 2 different process IDs so that those can handle the load and do load balancing there. And it's running on port 5001 this time. So we can go to port 5001, API, let's just go to port 5001, and that should redirect us to the health endpoint and give us that it's healthy. So it's kind of an inconsequential little step, but it makes a big difference having the the WSGI server set up there. Cool. I think that's about it. Any other questions on optimizations? Sure. Yeah.
Excuse me. I'm not familiar with Swagger and JavaScript. Like, is it the same thing? Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah.
API documentation, essentially?
Yep. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and there is, I had started setting it up in here, but there's a Flask Swagger UI, and it's really easy to just add in a Swagger UI service into your Flask application. And so it adds the endpoint for Swagger there. And so then your users can actually go, localhost 5000 Swagger docs, and they get it, and they can use it, and they can try changing the payloads and all that stuff. Yeah.
How would you describe Flask? Is it the model view controller, or how the request flows from the endpoint to the
Yeah, it's just RESTful endpoint. Yeah.
Can you imagine it as a pipeline, since it's a functional language? Can you imagine that kind of pipeline in this pipeline?
Yeah, it's a very kind of procedural entry point. Like Python kind of at its core is very procedural, and then you can wrap on that kind of some other paradigms if you want. And so that's kind of how Flask kind of works. It just kind of enters at that entry point and starts stepping down, and then at some point there you could, if you wanted, you could have asynchronous requests going off, and then you kind of lose your procedural flow. Flask is based on Jinja, which is a front-end framework, and that does use more of a, I'm not sure if it's exactly model view controller, but it's like there's a template and it's populating the template. It's kind of just like view controller. And then Python is kind of controlling the models on the back end. Cool. Yeah, so to wrap up, we talked a bit about history and philosophy, showed you quick setup, and basically Flask is quick and easy. Like we got through that first setup in spite of my typos and everything in like 10 minutes. And Python is powerful and gaining tons of popularity all the time. There's tons of libraries out there. And so by like wiring those together, there's huge potential of things you can do. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
Are you familiar with Flask RESTful? It's an abstraction layer that makes it easier to write.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering if you're familiar, like why you would choose Flask over Flask RESTful if you're just developing.
Yeah. I generally prefer kind of going with the lower level, whatever the lowest level is I can, unless there's like a benefit that I'm getting out of it. From my perspective, Flask REST Plus or RESTful. There's like a bunch of them that are kind of layered on there as convenience things or wrappers for it. And my experience with those types of things is they're really great for like getting up and running quickly, but then before you know it, you'll run into something that they didn't handle in the wrapper. And so, yeah, I kind of like going a little lower level. Yeah, I don't have experience with Flask REST Plus. I did actually, when I was first starting to play with Flask, I started using that because there was a tutorial I was using and looking at it, and then I realized I don't really need any of the things that it was providing. I like to have kind of more control. The same kind of goes for Mongo engine. I really like MongoDB, and I've gotten used to using just straight Mongo query language or whatever. And Mongo engine is just a wrapper on PyMongo. If you use PyMongo directly, then you can just use those same queries that you would use against MongoDB directly. So it makes it a little bit, you got more control. But kind of the same thing for me, where it's just a wrapper. But Mongo engine gives you enough benefits that I think it's kind of worth it. Cool, yeah. Well, thanks everyone.
Thank you so much, Terry. We're going to be hanging out for a little bit, so I think it's probably another hour or so. So if you want to hang out, if you want to talk to Terry and ask him more about Python, if you want to talk to me and not talk about Python, because I don't know nearly as well, you can do so. I think my Solomon here to help. Again, there's pizza. It looks like there's no more pizza, but there's at least beer. We have beer. So feel free.
There's empty pizza boxes.
Exactly, there's empty pizza boxes. So again, thank you all for coming so much. If you want to join us on the 5th, we would love to have you for scripting attacks and preventing them. So thank you all for coming.